November 333 BC, on the northeastern edge of the Mediterranean, in Cilicia, near the narrow coastal passage of Issus. Imagine 40,000 soldiers trapped in a strip of land between dark mountain ranges and the open sea. They were exhausted after weeks of hard marching, deep inside enemy territory and far from any easy rescue. On one side, sheer cliffs stood above them like a natural prison. On the other, the cold Mediterranean stretched wide, sealing the battlefield shut. And behind them, more than 100,000 Persian soldiers were pouring into the gap. The army closing around them carried Persian infantry, noble cavalry, royal guards, and Greek mercenaries paid to stop Macedonian spears with Greek steel. They could not retreat easily when the enemy king had cut the road behind them. They could not deploy freely when the battlefield forced their army into a narrow passage. And they should not have survived when a much larger empire caught them between mountains, sea, and a collapsing road home. Leading those trapped men was Alexander the Great, the undefeated 23-year-old king of Macedon. He had led his army deep into Persian territory, chasing glory, revenge, and the collapse of Persian power. But now, at Issus, the land around him was turning into a cage. Behind him stood Darius III, King of Kings, bringing the full power of the Persian Empire into Alexander's rear. Persian dust rolled across the horizon behind the Macedonian army. Royal banners rose above a massive force stretching along the narrow coastline. Alexander's men were not standing on a vast plain where they could spread out, maneuver, and breathe. They were trapped in a coastal corridor where the mountains pressed down on one side and the sea closed the other. But the same ground that trapped Alexander also limited Darius. The Persian army was enormous, but the battlefield was too narrow for such a force to use its full strength. Darius had brought a giant army into a place where size itself could become a weakness. For any normal commander, this was the moment to panic. For Alexander, it became a problem to solve. The Battle of Issus would decide whether the young Macedonian king was trapped by the empire, or whether the empire had trapped itself. Issus was not the battle Alexander had planned to fight. It happened because Alexander misread where danger was moving. After defeating Persian forces at the Granicus River, Alexander pushed along the coast of Asia Minor. He was not simply chasing cities, he was taking ports, harbors, roads, and coastal strongholds that supported Persian sea power. The Persian fleet was still dangerous behind him. If Persian ships kept their bases, they could threaten the Aegean, stir rebellion in Greece, and cut pressure into Alexander's rear. So Alexander moved south, believing the next great danger lay ahead of him. He marched towards Syria and Phoenicia, expecting Darius to block him somewhere farther down the road. But in war, the road you think is safe can become the road that traps you. Alexander reached Issus first. The city fell quickly. The Macedonian army passed through the region and continued south. Before leaving, Alexander made a practical decision that would soon become dangerous. He left behind sick and wounded Macedonian soldiers who could no longer keep pace with the campaign. They remained at Issus because the road behind the army seemed secure. Alexander believed he was moving forward while his rear stayed protected. That was the mistake. Darius did not wait where Alexander expected him. The Persian king crossed through the Amanus Mountains and slipped behind the Macedonian army. He moved into the space Alexander had just left. He seized Issus after the Macedonians had passed. And inside the city, Darius found the wounded men Alexander had left behind. They were executed. When the news reached Alexander, the meaning of the campaign changed in a single moment. Darius was not standing ahead of him. Darius was behind him. The King of Kings had touched Alexander's rear road. He had seized the city Alexander had just left. He had shown that no wounded soldier, no supply line, and no road home was safe. Alexander could no longer keep marching south toward Phoenicia and Egypt. If he continued forward, Darius could cut his supplies and control the road back through Cilicia. If he hesitated, the Persian army could tighten the trap behind him. If he tried to retreat without order, his men could be crushed between the mountains and the sea. Issus became unavoidable because Alexander's campaign could not survive with Darius sitting in its rear. The road to Egypt had to wait. The road behind him had to be saved first. So Alexander turned the army around. The men who had been marching south now faced back toward the danger. The coastline that had looked like a route of conquest now became a narrow path back into a trap. Ahead of them stood Darius, the royal army, and the full weight of Persia. Behind them lay the campaign Alexander still wanted to continue. At Issus, the mistake had already been made. Now Alexander had to turn that mistake into a battlefield he could survive. When Alexander decided to turn back, speed mattered more than ceremony. There was no time for a long speech in front of the army. The danger was already visible in every messenger, every rumor, and every face that understood what Darius had done. Issus had been seized. The wounded had been killed. The Persian king stood where no enemy should have been allowed to stand. Alexander gathered his commanders and chose movement over hesitation. The army would march back through the night. They would reach the passes before dawn. They would not allow Darius to make the trap stronger while the Macedonians waited. The army moved in darkness along the narrow coastal road. Torches were kept low so the long column did not reveal too much of itself. Orders passed quietly from officer to officer. Men marched with the black mass of the mountains rising on one side. Beyond the darkness on the other side, the Mediterranean moved unseen beside them. Every step carried the Macedonians closer to the army that had cut their rear. By midnight, they reached the high ground again. The pass was secured before the Persians could fully use it against them. Sentries took position among the rocks, watching the roads below. The army rested in silence, waiting for daylight to show the field. At dawn, the darkness lifted over Cilicia. Below them lay the narrow plain near Issus. There was no wide battlefield waiting for them. There was no open ground where Alexander could arrange every movement freely. There was only a cramped strip of land between mountain and sea. Across that strip ran the Pinarus River. Beyond the river stood the Persian army. Rank after rank filled the narrow ground. Banners rose from the dust. Cavalry crowded near the shoreline. Infantry pressed into the center. Darius stood in the royal center, surrounded by guards, nobles, standards, and the symbols of empire. Alexander could now see both the danger and the opportunity. The Persian army was enormous, but it was squeezed into the same corridor as his own army. The battlefield did not reward size alone. It rewarded control, timing, discipline, and nerve. Darius had brought a force built to overwhelm, but Issus forced that force to compress. Cavalry could not sweep endlessly around the flanks. Infantry could not stretch across a vast plain. Thousands of men stood behind thousands of men, crowded inside a space too tight for imperial power to breathe. Alexander formed his army carefully. The Macedonian phalanx took the center, with long sarissas pointing toward the river like a wall of wood and iron. On the left, Parmenion commanded the troops nearest the sea. That wing would face the strongest Persian cavalry pressure with little room to fall back. On the right, Alexander took position with the companion cavalry. This was the wing that would carry the decisive movement. Across the river, Darius arranged his own line. Greek mercenaries stood near the center, placed where the fighting would be hardest. These men were professional soldiers, trained in Greek-style warfare and paid to stop the Macedonian phalanx. Persian infantry filled the ground behind them. Archers waited farther back. Cavalry massed near the sea, where the land opened just enough for horsemen to matter. At the center, Darius remained visible in his chariot. He was not hidden behind the army. He was displayed before it. The empire had to see its king standing on the field. This was the battle before the battle. A young king stared across a river at the visible heart of an empire. A vast empire crowded itself into a narrow strip of land, and between them waited the shallow water of the Pinarus. The first heavy pressure came near the shoreline. Persian cavalry surged forward along the coastal ground, driving hard toward Parmenian's flank. From high above, the movement would have looked like a dark wave rolling beside the sea. Parmenian could not simply give ground. Behind him stood the rest of the Macedonian line. Beside him was the Mediterranean. If his flank collapsed, Persian horsemen could turn inward and strike the Macedonian center from the side. So the Macedonian left met the attack near the shore. Cavalry collided close to the sea, with horses pressing into horses and shields shaking under impact. Dust mixed with sea wind as both sides struggled for control of the narrow coastal edge. The Macedonian left bent under the pressure, but Parmenian's men kept the flank alive. They were fighting to prevent the whole army from being rolled up beside the Mediterranean. At the same time, the Macedonian center began moving toward the Pinarus River. The phalanx advanced with sarissas lowered. At first, the line kept its rhythm. Then the ground began to break that rhythm apart. The riverbank was uneven. The water slowed the front ranks. Some men stepped into shallow water while others climbed over mud and stone. A phalanx needed spacing to remain deadly. Issus attacked that spacing with every step. Small gaps opened between the ranks. The Greek mercenaries in Persian service struck into those pressure points. They did not panic when the Macedonians approached. They did not collapse when the sarissas reached them. They met the phalanx with discipline, experience, and violence. The fight in the center became brutal and unstable. Spears drove forward against shields. Men slipped at the water's edge. The long sarissas struggled for space where the riverbank broke the line. The Macedonian center began to lose its perfect shape. It was not breaking, but it was bending under real pressure. Persian infantry surged down toward the river. Thousands pressed against the Macedonian line. The Pinarus became a place of crushing force, with Macedonians fighting upward from the water while Persians pushed from the bank. For a dangerous moment, Alexander's army looked vulnerable. The left was under pressure near the sea. The center was locked in brutal combat at the river. If both parts failed together, the army could fold inside the narrow corridor. Then Alexander moved on the Macedonian right. The companion cavalry gathered around him in a tight formation. The horsemen did not drift into scattered action. They became a single weapon pointed at the Persian left. Alexander looked toward the side of the Persian army that stood between him and the royal center. If that side held, Darius could keep the battlefield connected. If it broke, the path inward would begin to open. The signal came. The companions surged forward. They crossed the Pinarus with speed and force. They struck the Persian left before it could settle into control. The first Persian line buckled under the impact. Shields shifted as men stepped back into the crowded ground behind them. Alexander did not stop at the first break. He drove through it. The Persian left staggered, then began to collapse. While Parmenian fought to survive near the sea and the phalanx struggled in the center, Alexander had broken the edge of the Persian line. Now the battle could turn inward. After breaking the Persian left, Alexander did not ride off after scattered soldiers. He did not waste the opening on a pursuit that would leave his own center under pressure. He turned inward toward the middle of the Persian army. This movement changed the battle. The Macedonian center was still under heavy pressure at the river. Parmenian's left was still fighting near the sea. The phalanx had been bent by the riverbank and the mercenaries holding the Persian center. Alexander's charge now became more than an attack on the enemy. It became the movement that relieved pressure on his own army. The companions and nearby infantry drove into the Persian center from the flank. Packed Persian troops were struck from an angle they had not prepared for. Men who had been pressing forward suddenly felt force cutting into their side. The crowded terrain made the blow worse. There was little room to turn. There was little room to open space. There was little room to rebuild the line. The Persian center began to tear under pressure from a direction it could not easily answer. Dust covered the royal line. Bodies crowded the riverbank. standards swayed above the confusion. Through the dust and collapsing ranks, Alexander saw what mattered most. The royal chariot came into view through the chaos of the center. The royal standard shook above the mass of men around it. Darius stood at the visible center of imperial power. Around him gathered guards, nobles, attendants, horses, and the ceremony of kingship. But now the battle was moving toward him. The Greek mercenaries still fought. Persian cavalry still battled near the sea. The whole Persian army had not yet been destroyed. That is what made the moment so dangerous. Darius was not being threatened after the battle had already been lost. He was being threatened while the battle was still undecided. The royal center tightened around him. Guards moved closer. Horses shifted in panic. Chariot wheels struggled in the crowded ground. The narrow corridor now turned against the King of Kings. On an open plain, Darius might have pulled back behind fresh troops. He might have created distance, restored order, and formed another line. At Issus, there was no easy space. His own army filled the ground behind him. The mountains and the sea held the battlefield in place. The huge force meant to overwhelm Alexander now made movement harder for its own king. Alexander drove closer. Every meter mattered. The distance between the Macedonian charge and the royal chariot shrank. For Persian soldiers, the sight was more dangerous than any speech. They did not need to understand every tactical detail. They only needed to see the royal center under threat. An army can suffer losses and keep fighting. But if its king appears unsafe, fear begins to move faster than command. Darius hesitated as the Macedonian attack pressed closer to the royal position. The pressure around the chariot became too great for confidence to survive. Then the royal chariot turned away from the fighting. Darius fled. The King of Kings left the battlefield while fighting still raged. That was the wound Alexander opened, not only in the Persian line, but in Persian authority itself. Once Darius fled, the army did not collapse because every soldier had been defeated. It collapsed because the symbol holding it together had vanished. The king who had come to trap Alexander was now running from him. Darius's flight did not end every fight at once. Across the battlefield, some Persian units were still locked in combat near the river. Greek mercenaries continued pressing against the Macedonian center with discipline and violence. Near the sea, Persian cavalry still pushed hard against Parmenions' exhausted flank. But through the dust behind the royal center, Persian soldiers began to see something terrifying. The royal chariot was moving away from the battle. Guards around Darius were no longer holding position around a confident king. They were moving with him through the crowded rear. Royal standards that had stood at the center of Persian confidence began drifting backward through the dust. Soldiers who had not been defeated started looking over their shoulders. Officers tried to keep order, but the movement around the king had already begun spreading fear. The Persian center began losing its shape as men stepped back from the river line. One group retreated because the royal guard was moving. Another group followed because soldiers beside them had begun to pull away. The pressure that had once moved forward against Macedonia recoiled into the crowded Persian rear. The narrow battlefield turned retreat into disaster. Persian infantry jammed against cavalry. Horses forced through broken ranks. Wagons and equipment blocked the path behind the army. The Pinarus River became an obstacle again, but now it stood in the path of men trying to escape. The army that had entered the corridor as a display of imperial power was now trying to leave it in disorder. Darius escaped with his life as Alexander pursued him through the broken route of retreat. Night and distance saved the Persian king from capture, but the damage he left behind was enormous. When Alexander returned to the field, the royal camp of Persia still stood behind the battlefield. Inside it were gold, silver, tents, servants, wagons, and the abandoned wealth of an empire that had expected victory. More important than treasure, the family of Darius had been left in the camp. His mother, wife, and daughters had traveled with the royal army as part of the king's display of power. Now they were prisoners of Alexander. Alexander treated them with respect, not as common captives and not as trophies to be humiliated. His restraint inside the captured royal camp sent a message that was as political as it was personal. Alexander was not only presenting himself as a conqueror, he was presenting himself as a ruler worthy to inherit power. Issus did not destroy the Persian Empire in one day. Darius still lived, and the empire still had cities, gold, roads, governors, and armies far to the east. But something had changed that could not be repaired easily. The King of Kings had fled his own battlefield while parts of his army were still fighting. Before Issus, Alexander was a dangerous invader deep inside Persian territory. After Issus, he became the man who had made Darius run. From the royal camp at Issus, the news traveled across the eastern Mediterranean, reaching Persian governors, frightened coastal cities, and wavering allies. Persian authority had not vanished, but it had cracked in public before the eyes of the ancient world. The battle had not killed the empire. It had wounded the idea that held the empire together. After Issus, Alexander stood in a different world. He had not conquered Persia yet. Darius was still alive. The empire still stretched across enormous distances. Persia still had armies, governors, cities, gold, and time. But the campaign had changed direction. Alexander had survived the trap between the mountains and the sea. He had faced the King of Kings in person, and the King of Kings had fled. That fact moved faster than any army. It moved down the coast through Persian-held cities and uncertain harbors. It moved through the minds of local rulers, waiting to see which king looked stronger. It moved through the eastern Mediterranean like a warning. Darius could be reached. The royal army could be shaken. The Persian king could lose control in front of his own men. Issus opened the road south. From Cilicia, Alexander could move toward Syria. From Syria, he could move toward Phoenicia. From Phoenicia, he could take the ports that supported Persian naval power. Issus made that next stage possible. If Alexander had been destroyed in the narrow corridor, the road south could have ended there. There would have been no march down the Phoenician coast, no siege of Tyre, no road through the Mediterranean, no entrance into Egypt, and no Alexandria rising later beside the sea. Issus was the hinge between survival and conquest. Before it, Alexander was deep in enemy land with danger behind him. After it, he moved south with the authority of a man who had survived the Persian king. The cities of the coast now had to choose how they saw the war. Was Darius still strong enough to protect them? Or was Alexander becoming the power they could no longer ignore? That question would shape the eastern Mediterranean. Alexander turned toward Tyre. The island fortress stood off the Phoenician coast, proud, rich, and confident. For centuries, it had trusted its walls, its harbors, and the sea. It believed no land army could easily touch it. But Issus had taught the world something dangerous about Alexander. He did not only win when the ground favored him, he found the weakness inside the ground itself. At Issus, the mountains and sea seemed to trap him. Instead, he used the narrow battlefield to limit Persia's size. At Tyre, the Mediterranean would seem to block him. And again, he would look for a way to turn the impossible into a battlefield. The Battle of Issus was not just a victory in a narrow coastal plain. It was the moment Alexander proved he could strike at the heart of imperial power. It was the moment Darius became vulnerable in front of the world. It was the moment the road south opened, and it was the moment the war stopped being only Persia's attempt to crush an invader and became Alexander's march toward the places Persia could no longer fully protect.